Thank you, Anthony. I'm so glad my video was off for that introduction because I was very much blushing. But I'm so happy to be here as well. Really happy to see that people are coming from all over, from China, Malaysia, Ireland, New York City, really close to us. Me and Sam here are in the Hudson Valley, a little bit north of New York City. And I think Sam has also left Bard to focus on her writing. And also, I think a memoir is in the works. Is that true?
Yes, you're giving away my secrets, but
Sorry, I didn't know it was under wraps. Okay, all right, take
no,
that
no,
back, take
no,
that back.
no. Thank you so
Okay.
much for the generous introduction.
No, I'm thrilled to be able to have this conversation, and the book is so smart and so well written. I think it's really going to do a lot of good in the world. It's something I would definitely be looking at if I were teaching Arendts. Also, if I were just wanting to get an introduction to her work. And I'll also tell you, it made me cry. I mean, spoiler alert, I cried at the end when she dies. But I also cried at other parts in the book. There's so much loss in it, but it also made me feel like this person must have either had a really close personal connection with Arendt or developed one over the course of writing the book. Is my hunch true?
It is true. Wow. When I wrote Hannah Arendt's death, I was sitting in a cafe in New York City, and I had been sitting there for 12 hours straight and had nothing but coffee, and I just burst into tears. And I realized that writing her death meant a lot more to me than just an event in her book that I had to chronicle. But it was a kind of personal death. I felt in many ways as though I was letting go of a best friend that I had carried around in my imagination for almost 20 years. And there was a kind of catharsis in that, which I'm usually very suspicious of, but it felt liberating as well. When I was just starting to write the book, I was at a Hannah Arendt conference at Bard College, and a member of the Hannah Arendt Center came up to me very excitedly and said, "I'm so happy you're writing a biography." And I said, "Me too. I'm very excited. I'm very nervous." And she said to me very seriously, "I wish I didn't know how it ended." and at the time, I thought that was really funny. But then when it came to actually having to write that, I hadn't realized how embedded Arendt as a person, a figure, a persona had become in my own and thinking and imagination, how intertwined I felt in my thinking with her. And it was it very much felt like a romance, a relationship. I fell in love with Hannah Arendt in college when I picked up The Human Condition. And since then, it's been this kind of dance of I love her, I hate her, she's right, she's wrong, I have to put her down, I have to walk away from her, I go back to her. So yes, would be the shorter answer of that.
Yeah, and you mentioned it's like a friendship for you, which is an important theme in her work as well.
Yes.
Right, like that's a personal, and it's a theme in your book how much the friendships that she develops over time become part of the intellectual atmosphere that she's in and the projects that she takes on.
Very much so. I'm immediately reminded of her incredible 1964 interview with Günter Gauss, where he's talking to her about the trial of Adolf Eichmann and the letter that Gershom Scholem had sent to her, where he said, "You have no Ahavat Israel." And I write about this in the conclusion of the book, but she didn't love any people. She said to him, "I love my friends." And friends and her husband, Heinrich Bucher, were her home. They were her four walls. They are what gave her a sense of stability and durability in a world that during her lifetime was incredibly unstable and fragile or frail, as she might have said. That was a word that she went to often, but it was friendship that gave her a sense of durability, and also was so central to her thinking. Arendt is a relational thinker. Arendt is
Mm.
all about relationships. She's always attending to the space in between and trying to nourish that interest, those connections that we form with one another personally, but then also out in the world and with others.
Yeah, I think that's really right, and it's putting me in mind of the central relationship that she what's important to her about the Eichmann trial is that she goes to see this evildoer in the flesh, right? Like she doesn't want her relationship to be him to be abstract. She needs to understand what this evil is, and her conclusion is like, this is banal. I think you lay out really well in the book some of the ways that that statement has been misinterpreted, or the reasons it gave rise to one of the controversies for which she's best known. And I hope we will get to at least a couple of the others of the hot buttons. So the question that was still on my mind as I was reading through what you wrote about the Eichmann trial was actually about another central relationship in her life, which is that to Martin Heidegger, who's of course was her lover, central German philosopher, very important for her thinking as well. And so maybe it's strange to bring together the Eichmann trial with her relationship with Heidegger, but it seemed to me like she's coming to terms with Nazism and the crimes of the Nazi regime through the figure of Eichmann in one way, and she does it kind of repeatedly in her thinking, thinking about thinking and moral considerations. She thinks about evil as a kind of thoughtlessness. Does she come to terms with Heidegger's Nazism in the same way, in a different way? Is the personal relationship there primary? I, I don't know. Were those things in dialogue for you as you were writing? That really cropped up to me as a constellation, as it were.
I think that they are interrelated, certainly. Arendt said that she wanted to go to the trial to stand face to face with Eichmann. She said, I want to see the evildoer in the flesh. And just that image of standing face to face is so important to the way that Arendt thinks about questions like moral responsibility, judgment, reconciliation, forgiveness, and understanding. Arendt wanted to understand. It was always about the work of understanding for her, and there's no end to that work of understanding. And she wanted to understand what had happened, even though she thought it was incomprehensible in a certain way because it was so horrific. But she's always trying to move us to planting our feet on the earth and standing face to face with reality as it is. And when she went to stand face to face with Eichmann, she writes to her husband after the first day of the trial, the whole thing is so damn banal, right? And that was her first impression of the proceedings. And that was a reversal of the thesis that she had come to at the end of the Origins of Totalitarianism when it was published in 1951, that it had been a form of radical evil. And so in a similar fashion, she wants to understand what made Heidegger join the Nazi Party, become the rector, dismiss Edmund Husserl. And it's, I call this the Heidegger question. It's usually one of the first two questions that come up. But I'll give you a bit of a longer response today than my usual. I think Kant is more important for her philosophy than Heidegger is. That I don't think it ever fully settles. And that to me seems consistent with Arendt's approach to thinking, to understanding, to making meaning, to storytelling. These are ways of thinking that there is no end to. So we see that in her correspondence. Right after the end of the war, she writes to Karl Jaspers and she says, I don't know if I'm going to see Heidegger. Maybe I'll go see Heidegger. I don't know if I want to see Heidegger. Heidegger is essentially responsible for the murder of Husserl and others. And then she writes letters to complete strangers where she says, Heidegger was never really a Nazi. And I think that she's wrestling with it throughout the course of her life. I think she's trying to understand how this man who she loved, she had a very passionate relationship with him, could have succumbed to this kind of ideology. And of course, the Black Notebooks were published after her death, so she didn't have access to the extent of his anti-Semitism as it is recorded in those notebooks. And it would be very interesting to know how she might have responded to that. But for Eichmann and for Heidegger, she wants to understand. And the other side of this is, for Arendt, the personal is not political.
Mm-hmm.
Love is not only apolitical, it is the most powerful of all anti-political human forces. Our intimate relationships are something that we hold privately to ourselves, and they don't appear in the world. And Arendt's relationship with Heidegger did not become public knowledge until 1982, when Elizabeth Young Bruhl published the first biography of Hannah Arendt, For the Love of the World.
Yeah. You're bringing up the classic feminist slogan, and so it's making me think about what you write and about her relationship to feminism. And it seems like she has this tribe of her friends, but she in general is quite suspicious of ideology and groupthink, and fiercely independent in her thinking. That seems to be one reason that she rejects the women's movement, right? I'm not a feminist just because I'm a woman. But there's something deeper here, right? Like there's something that's a problem for her about the personal becoming political. Is that right?
Yes. So I think it's an important intervention, and there are different ways to read it. For Arendt, the personal is not inherently political. The thing to remember about Arendt is that she's a kind of weird phenomenologist. She has this kind of phenomenological materialism. So nothing inherently is. Just because one is born a woman doesn't mean they belong to some movement by virtue of that. Who we are and what we are different in Arendt's understanding of the world and what it means to be a person in the world. The personal is not inherently political, but the personal is often politicized. And I think that is her point. So if you go to page 2 of The Human Condition, in the first part, she says, everything is touched by politics.
H2, okay.
uh-huh. I can pull it off, but she uses the word touched. Mm-hmm. So after the prologue in the first chapter there at the bottom of the page, but she uses the word touched. And I like that idea, because what she's drawing our attention to there is the ways in which our lives are instrumentally politicized to achieve certain ends by movements, by politicians, by institutions. And these categories for her, personal, political, social, private, labor, work, action, she's doing all of this conceptual work. These are not fixed concepts. They're not crystallized concepts. They're not hard and fast boundaries. They're porous. Obviously, the personal is politicized often, and then that becomes a subject of politics. Arendt swore a holy oath never to touch the question of American feminism. She was really put off by second wave feminism. There's a letter lurking in the archive from many a feminist trying to bring her into the movement, and she doesn't respond to any of them, as far as I can tell. And I read her understanding of the woman problem in line with Rosa Luxemburg. And that's the one essay that she writes about the question of feminism and women's inequality within society. And it's a book review that's published in 1929 of a German book by Rahel Gerstein on, I think, Die Frauen Problem. And she talks about how it's a question of economic inequality, that if we want to address the inequality of women within society, we have to approach it economically and not politically.
Yeah, I love the anecdote you tell too about not wanting to be tokenized as the first woman professor at Princeton. Just, I'm used to being a woman. It's not a problem for me to be a woman
That was,
professor.
yes, that was in an interview. She threatened to withdraw her acceptance of the offer to teach if that's how they were going to publicize it in the New York Times as the first woman professor. She did not want to be known that way. She wanted to be known for her work, not being a woman, not being a Jew. She didn't want to be the exception Jew. She didn't want to be the exception woman.
Yeah, I relate to that. But it, it made me think about, you know, you're talking about these letters that you're finding, and one of the things I'm always curious about is the adventure in the archives and the things that you found that surprised you. I know you traveled all over for this book and were visiting lots of different dusty piles of papers, and I don't know, tell us one of your archive stories, something you found that surprised you or
Oh
delighted
goodness.
you, or so many to choose from, I'm sure.
Well, since the topic of, I always talk about the experience of finding Walter Benjamin's thesis on the philosophy of history, because that was a very moving moment for me. But
Almost Lost? Was that one of the documents that was almost lost in their fleeing?
So when they parted ways in Marseille, Benjamin entrusted Arendt with a suitcase of his final writings. And she carried those to the United States and was responsible for the first English publications of his work. But Benjamin would send many copies of his works to his friends. So Bataille in Paris, Scholem in Jerusalem, Gretel Adorno in New York, to attempt to ensure their survival, because, well, I'll just say he was not hopeful. And they are in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and Hannah Arendt's papers, and they're beautiful paper bands, orange, blue, green, yellow, with his little scrawl. And they are, I mean, aura is the word Benjamin often would turn to, but certainly possess that. That was a very, I think, early important moment for me in exploring archives. But as I was researching this book, there are two things that I discovered that I had not been prepared for. One was at the New York Public Library, and the other was at the Baudelaire, which very kindly sent me our folders and folders of archival documents during the pandemic because I could not travel there. And she had met Hans Morgenthau at the University of Chicago in the 60s when she went to teach there, and they became very close friends, spent New Year's together, watched the JFK election there together, and they had a late in life love affair, and there are some love letters between them that I had not been expecting to find. Of Morgenthau proposed marriage to her after they took a vacation to Greece together, and she said no, that she was too old, and so I included one letter where he's pleading with her to let him love her, which I found to be very moving. And the other document at the New York Public Library are Arendt's emigration papers that have been collected. So all of the forms that she had to fill out before she arrived in America. And the United States was not her first choice. Her first choice was London, was to go to the UK and to teach at Sciences Po, where she unfortunately did not get an offer. And her third choice was Palestine.
Right. Yeah. I was thinking one of the choices that you made in the biography, which I think distinguishes it from what seems to be out there, is also including some of her poems that she wrote. And I think maybe a lot of people don't know that Arendt was also a poet on the side. You know it. You're also working on a translation of her poetry. But I loved the one that she sent to her husband returning to Europe after she'd been in America for a while. And she talks about becoming unlost. And I just thought that was so lovely. And I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about Arendt the poet and how you see I mean, Heidegger also wrote poetry, but it's a special thing when a thinker also has an artistic side, I think.
Yeah. So this takes us back to the beginning of our conversation in a way, because as far as we know, Arendt began writing poems when she went to study with Heidegger. And many of the first poems were enclosed in letters to him, copies of them. And he also wrote poems for her, which can be found in their correspondence. I like to extend to Arendt the compliment that she gave to Walter Benjamin in her essay, Walter Benjamin, which is that she was a poetic thinker without being a poet. There are 74 poems in total. They'll be published in English with Librite next year. And she wrote 23 before the war, which she carried with her into exile. And then she typed them up when she arrived in New York and continued writing them throughout her thinking notebooks in the United States. And so you can find them in her notebooks and her correspondence, and then the folder of 23 poems from 1923-24 up to the beginning of the war. The first poem that she writes in 1942, after a 16-year gap during the interwar years, is WB for Walter Benjamin. And then the poem that you're referencing, Drive Through France, is a reflection on returning to France for the first time after the war. And she's struck by the beauty of the countryside. Earth writes poetry, field after field, braiding trees alongside, and thinking about nature. And also the quality of her poems changes over time, I would say. And she goes from kind of young, girlish imitation of German romantic poetry. Sehen wir uns wieder, wenn Blut weiße Flieder. Ich halte dich in Kissen, du sollst nicht mehr wissen. You know, which is really rather silly and playful. And then a lot of the poems after the war, though, are free form, free verse. And she's reflecting on experiences and events, on friends that she's lost, on trips that she's taking. There's a poem called on the Hudson, where she's walking by the water by her house near Riverside Drive. And I think some of those are quite beautiful, where she's also working out ideas that find their way into her published text. So 2 poems are almost verbatim written as prose into the human condition. One which is nearly untranslatable in German, which is Dicht für Dicht, das Gedicht. But in the human condition becomes, she writes it as the density of the poem, which allows it to remain and gives it its durability.
Yeah, I was going to ask if the compliment of being a poetic thinker without being a poet is a sort of backhanded way of saying not a very good poet. But I think you answered that in your reply, which was maybe yes, maybe no.
The other side of this, which I think is just really wonderful to go back to friendship for a second, is that Hannah Arendt arrived in New York on May 22nd, 1941. And she did not speak English. She publishes The Origins of Totalitarianism in 1951, and she's writing articles in between on Kafka and book reviews of Brock. And she has her articles, what she calls Englished, when she first arrives, but they're being Englished by Randall Jarrell, by Brock, by Auden. She's learning to write in English from the New York poets, who are then also introducing her to Emily Dickinson, who she loves. Wow. And other, the language of poetry becomes part of her English writing style. But she says, you know, it is not just the mother language that remained for her after the war, it's the language of German poetry. She had memorized Goethe and Hölderlin and Schiller, in addition to all of the Odyssey and classic Greek, which she could recite on command at the age of 14. We'll leave that over here. You know, but that is what she held on to in her thinking. That was something that she had carried with her from Europe.
I mean, absolutely brilliant, not in question. But I'm thinking at the same time, as she's not quite a poet, but she's also quite suspicious philosophy, and sort of also eschews that term. And one of the letters that she writes to one of her friends, she says that intellectual is a hateful term. And I was wondering if you could unpack that distancing as well, right? Neither one nor the other, exactly, by her account.
Yes.
Why is she so hostile to philosophy? What does philosophy have to answer for?
Uh-oh, do you feel Hannah Arendt?
Well, I have a suspicion. I want to know if it's the same as yours.
So after the burning of the Reichstag in 1933, after that February, Hannah Arendt turned away from what she called the professional world of philosophers. And that's a Kant term, that's a Kantian term that she's picking up and doing her own thing with. But when the chips were down, the professional thinkers failed to hold themselves morally accountable. And instead of resisting the tide of fascism, they went along with the Nazification of cultural and political and educational institutions. The thinkers, the professional philosophers who spend their life talking about what's good, what's bad, the meaning of being, and what's evil, were no better equipped to handle fascism than anybody else. And so Arendt she uses the word dismantle the work of metaphysics. She wants to turn away from philosophy to argue that everybody is capable of thinking. And she's thinking about the traditional hierarchy between the vita activa, the life of action, and the vita contemplativa, the life of the mind, which was reserved for the few who had the time and leisure and privilege to engage in philosophical speculation and thinking. But the other problem with that is that they weren't thinking from experience in the world. They were thinking about ideals. They were thinking about transcendental concepts that have no bearing on reality. You can sit around and think about what the right thing to do is all day, but when the chips are down, how are you going to actually act in the world? And to determine that, you have to think from experience. You have to think from the world as it is and not from the world as you want it to be or wish it was. One of the stories that she repeats in multiple places throughout her book is the story of the philosopher Thales, who is so caught up in the stars that he trips and falls down a well. And there's the Thracian maid laughing at him. I think I've always kind of thought of Oren as that Thracian girl laughing at the philosophers. She says, humor is much more serious way to treat these experiences. And for her, she wanted to distance herself from those professional thinkers, from those philosophers who can't help us fight.
Yeah. Although there's also the story about Thales that he bought up all the olive presses one year, knowing that it was going to be a bumper crop, and then all the farmers had to come to him to rent the olive presses, and he made a small fortune. And I think Aristotle tells that one to say, well,
Yeah.
philosophers could choose to be rich if they decided to put their energy in that direction, but so they do not choose. But you're thinking of, and I think your answer largely accords with my sense, which is so it's a theme you keep coming back to. Thinking has to be grounded in experience for her, and that's not just inductive thinking. That's really what gives rise to the richness of her thought and the many directions that it can go while not having a banister, while not having a methodology or a framework. But it made me wonder about the experience of this past year, which was just like a hell of a year, right? Like personally, politically, the race riots, the fears of our American democracy. Would it be able to withstand COVID? Would it be able to withstand QAnon? And I was just curious, because understanding is this project that's never ending, if there was something that you came to understand differently in Arendt this year, if there was something that that changed for you in reading her, or things that you were thinking about more this year than you had in past years?
Oh, that's such a good question. Thank you for that
Assuming,
question.
assuming you got any thinking done this year at all, and we're just on.
Well, I mean, in all fairness, I'm pretty introverted, and I live alone in the middle of the woods. So I was very fortunate in so many respects. what this past year, and I've been thinking about this a lot, and I haven't found a way to put it in writing yet, but what I have been thinking about is Arendt's concept of solitude and her distinction between solitude and loneliness. For the most part, Arendt treats loneliness as a political concept. She's not thinking about the affective experience of loneliness, but she contrasts it with the experience of solitude. And solitude is essential for her conception of thinking. Solitude is where you can pleasurably be alone with yourself and engage in the two in one of dialogue, where you're in harmony of self and you can have a conversation with yourself, where your self-consciousness can call your conscience into conversation. And that's a space. That space of solitude is a space. And I thought that I always got it. Like I thought, yeah, okay, solitude, I go home after a day of work, I close the door, like Machiavelli, I put on my robe and I sit and I read Hannah Arendt and we have long conversations about her distinction between private and public. And then I go about, my life. And that's not it. That's not it. It's not just when I go for a walk every day, the conversation that always, the interlocutors who manifest in my head and the back and forth we have. When she's talking about solitude as the space that we need for thinking, it requires a very serious form of withdrawal. And Chiara, maybe this is something relevant to both of our lives right now, since we have both left our jobs to pursue writing and thinking full time. But the amount of withdrawal that it actually takes is extraordinary. And so even in quarantine, I kept kind of hoping for this sense of being able to withdraw from action. Arendt says, in order to think, you have to stop acting. It takes a lot of energy and thought to actually stop acting. It's not just turning off the phone, turning off the computer, shutting down the Wi-Fi, closing the doors. It's also clearing the psychic space in your head so that your thinking isn't engaged in activities that are also a part of your life. And that's a deep, internal, intimate sense of solitude, to be able to so fully be present in the now and to focus on thinking as the activity that you're engaging in, which is so incredibly hard to do. And so difficult to find that kind of space and time to think, to actually create the space of solitude.
I would say that I'm going to think more about that, but I I have a feeling it will be difficult for me to even create the conditions to begin thinking about what you just said. But thank you for that answer. I think that's a wonderful thing to have taken away over this past year, and something that's really just one of the less mentioned ways in which Arendt continues to inspire new constellations of meaning for us. I know there's a lot of questions from the audience, which is one of my favorite parts. So I just want to ask one. I just want to say one thing and ask one thing, which is that the question is, what is one thing that you would want people to take away from the biography of Arendt? And I'll tell you that I think the thing that struck me the most was how tremendously courageous she was, and thinking about, in terms of solitude, the image I have is her walking out of the internment camp in France, insisting on going it alone while other women left in pairs. She thought it was going to be safer to be alone. She wasn't afraid to be alone, and into the unknown, not having no idea where her husband was, no idea where her family was. And just, I'm like, how did you do that without even a cell phone map? Like the logistics of it to me are staggering, let alone the emotional wherewithal to do that. So that's the image that I'm carrying away from your book, with thanks to you for writing it.
Well, I thank you for that. And of course, you've read the book, and that's the last sentence of the introduction, which is, I hope that this book will give us some courage. in the moment we're living through now, just the story of Arendt's life. The work that I've been engaged in on Hannah Arendt for the past 2 years, and the writing of this book, I have wanted to disrupt the image of Arendt as this very serious, constantly smoking figure clad in black, bent over a table thinking. Hannah Arendt, Jerry Cohn, Arendt's literary executor, who's just the most magnificent person in the world, will tell you stories about her getting drunk in her apartment and jumping up on the kitchen table and lifting her skirts and singing Brecht in German. I mean, she was so incredibly vivacious. She was driven by what she understood to be a craving, a desire to understand the world and to experience life. And experience and thinking for her go hand in hand. We can't uncouple her life experiences from the work that she wrote. And so I want people to read the book and leave with an image of this great thinker who was also incredibly politically active throughout her life, engaged in all kinds of Jewish political work, and was incredibly courageous, but also vivacious. She was so alive. And that desire, that hunger for life is so central to everything that she did. I think that's part of what having that, whatever that is what allowed her to walk out of that internment camp alone.
Amazing. That's a great counterpoint that comes together with the solitude image and feels unlocking just to hear it and see that. Okay, so questions from our wonderful people in the audience, and we're so sorry we can't see you, and thank you for being here. It's really, yeah, you give us the reason for being here. So I'll just start at the top. Somebody anonymous says, Arendt's doctoral thesis was on Augustine. Was her focus on him related to this relationality of her thinking, the inter-essay that you mentioned, Sam? How much of Augustine can be seen in her later works? That's a good question.
Oh, wonderful question. So Arendt wrote her dissertation on concepts of love in St. Augustine under the direction of Karl Jaspers at the University of Heidelberg. She published it in German in 1929 at the age of 23. And it's a really important text for understanding a lot of Arendt's later work, because she comes back to Augustine at the end of the Origins of Totalitarianism. She comes back to Augustine to conceptualize mentality in the human condition. And I think most importantly, she's turning to Augustine's conception of caritas as a form of political love that allows us to care for the world and to care for other people in the world with us. And what she found in Augustine, especially under the direction of Jaspers, was a way of thinking that was necessarily worldly and conversational. For Heidegger, who she had studied with before she arrived in Heidelberg, thinking was something that one did alone. It was a solitary activity that was done in the mountains at a hut, cut off from other people entirely. And Arendt brings her conception of thinking and understanding of the world back down here. And she says it's always relational. Our thinking moves from our experiences that we have in the world. It's conditioned by plurality. And she gets there through Augustine's conception of caritas.
Mm. Ana Carolina Batista de Oliveira Correa asks, Samantha spoke about the shift in Arendt's thinking about evil between Origins of Totalitarianism and Eichmann. I wish she could comment more on that. Thanks.
Sure. So Arendt, at the end of the Origins of Totalitarianism, in the chapter on totalitarianism and power, Arendt talks about the phenomenal appearance of totalitarianism as a radically new form of government, as a form of radical evil in the world that's defined by the complete absence of spontaneity and the invention of death camps. And when Arendt comes to write her reportage on Eichmann in Jerusalem, she is not just wrestling with this radically new form of government as she sees it that emerged in the 20th century, but she's also, and this goes back to Augustine to tie the two questions together, she's wrestling with the theological problem of evil. But for Arendt, it's not about trying to prove the existence of an omnipotent God who allowed evil to exist in the world. For Arendt, it's a secular conception of what allows such horrific acts of evil to be willed in the world and how we have to hold people accountable for their actions.
Mm. And someone's asking an interesting question about the university, whether this is a place where this thinking can happen. Douglas Berman, did Arendt view the modern university as a place where the plurality in speech can continue to exist? The human condition seems pessimistic in the way it speaks to the liquidation of the public sphere, but did Arendt view the university as a viable substitute? My 2 cents, I think she was ambivalent, and perhaps one reason she refused to accept tenure. Aha, a
Well, you've
hypothesis.
written about this, Chiara, a bit
Have I?
on Arendt's conception of education and the university and what it is for in our contemporary times. So if you look at Arendt's thinking notebooks, and I think it's 1966 to 69, she has some comments about the transformations that are happening within the modern university. And she's very worried about what's happening with the shift in power from faculty governance to boards of trustees and the ways in which public universities were being privatized and what that meant for the agency and authority of the professor in the classroom. For Arendt, educational institutions were for education and should not be instrumentalized politically. And of course, this gets us into some of Arendt's most criticized work, where she argues against the institution of Black studies and the Black Power movement and the way in which these political movements come to intersect with the university in the 1960s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember you tweeting about this time last year. Someone was like, "What do you read for Arendt on race?" And you just were like, "That's not who I turn to for thinking about race." And I was like, "Yeah, that's like a diplomatic way of."
Arendt didn't understand. It's an article I would love to write sometime in the future, but Arendt did not understand the complexities of race in America. And I tried to just let that stand in the biography, but it was difficult. Those were difficult parts to write about.
I think you did it in a non-judgmental and accurate way. And it's strange though, because she does get it in Origins of Totalitarianism, and then in the American context, she doesn't. So it's strange. Yeah, but it's not about my thoughts anymore.
I love your
Conti. Yeah, let's talk later. Hal Conti asks, also recently there has been questioning about why intellectuals turn to anti-democratic movements. I'm reading Anne Applebaum's book, The Twilight of Democracy. Insofar as she is remotely okay with intellectuals, is the sense of responsibility among intellectuals something that Arendt would see as a way to avoid, or in fact, the cause of this tendency?
Great question. So that's a question that Arendt actually poses in an exam she gives in 1955 for a course she's teaching on contemporary issues at Berkeley. And question 5 or 6, and she says, why are intellectuals drawn to ideologies? Something like that. This goes back to our earlier conversation about why Arendt chose to turn away from philosophy. Arendt's essay on Heidegger, the Fox, where she tries to offer an account of why Heidegger could be taken with fascist ideology, she says that he was so ensnared in his own way of thinking about the world that he was unable to actually see what was unfolding before his eyes. And so this is part of Arendt's critique of professional thinkers. And I think the kind of the through line there for her is that any form of thinking that leads us to a framework for how to discern what is happening in front of us is turning us away from holding ourselves accountable in our thinking. So any kind of ideology, whether it's a left-wing ideology or a right-wing ideology for Arendt, is very dangerous because it means that you're disavowing your own democratic responsibility to engage in the work of thinking. Arendt wasn't even fond of representative democracy because she thought it was it was relinquishing our democratic right and responsibility to participate in the public sphere and the laws that govern our lives. I think a lot of her, when I'm giving an introductory, I'll just say one more thing. When I'm giving an introductory lecture on Arendt, I always start with 2 questions that I think underpin most of Arendt's work. The first is, gibt es ein Denken, das nicht tyrannisch ist? Is there a way of thinking that is not tyrannical? That's a question she writes in one of her notebooks. Is there a way of thinking that is not tyrannical? She follows it with the sentence, the point is to resist being subsumed in the tide at all. And that's the tide of ideological thinking. And that's her conception of thinking, which is always moving, never comes to an end. The other question is, how do we protect spaces of freedom? How do we create durable institutions that can protect spaces of freedom where people are free to act and appear in the world?
Yeah, would she be optimistic at this point, do you think? I mean, I think this is important to pull out that freedom is her central.
Answer.
Yeah. It almost doesn't need words. Yeah.
I just finished teaching two classes of the human condition, which I've been doing all month. And the first thing I always say to them is, this is not an optimistic book. Arendt is not an optimist, but the core of that book is that Arendt is not hopeful that freedom can be saved in modernity. She is, I think, a lot of the phenomena that we have been experiencing in the past several years would be large red flags to her. I don't think it is totalitarianism, certainly not in the way that she defined it, but we're experiencing a new constellation of elements which are foreclosing freedom in our contemporary era that she would have been attentive to, and urged us to be attentive to.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm trying to see which of these questions kind of picks up on the thread here. Let's see. Oh, this one seems to tag on to what you're saying about human condition. Joel Mills is asking, in The Human Condition, Arendt explores what technology means to mankind, describing an earth alienation and a gap between science and human phenomenal knowledge. And she returns to this in between past and future. Do you think she was optimistic about the future and the human capacity for action? Yeah, at risk of reprising the answer you just gave.
Well, another side of it.
Tell us more. Yeah.
The axiom that Arendt gives us at the end of the prologue to The Human Condition is, the point is to stop and think what we are doing. And she begins that book with a reflection on Sputnik and the way in which that reoriented our gaze toward the earth. But her point there, her political point, is that science and technology have outpaced human thinking. And like many thinkers and philosophers of her time, she was very critical of this narrative of the progress of the Enlightenment and the ways in which technology is going to liberate us to a better future. And she saw the ways in which technology were used to organize death camps. I don't think that's a rejection of the idea that we can improve the ordinary conditions of everyday life, but it is a rejection of progress. And she talks about that explicitly in many places. It's not that science and technology are bad at all. It's how we use them and how we stop and think about the ways in which science and technology are either dehumanizing the world that we live in or creating a more human world for appearance and action.
Yeah, she says somewhere in Origins of Totalitarianism, oh, it's quite possible that one fine day, highly organized and mechanized humanity will conclude quite democratically, namely by majority decision, that for humanity as a whole, it would be better to liquidate certain parts thereof, which always stands out for me as her lack of optimism around the questions of technology and political freedom.
Yes. Well, there are questions.
Yeah. Could you please talk about the concept of nativity and its importance for human freedom and Arendt's political theorizing?
Natality?
Mariana.
Or
I think she probably does mean natality. Yeah, Mariana Budjarin.
Okay. Yes. So freedom for Arendt is synonymous with this understanding of new beginnings. To just tie it to our conversation about origins we were having, totalitarianism prohibited the possibility of spontaneous action. And she writes that totalitarianism is never interested in the miracle, ideology is never interested in the miracle of new beginnings. Every time we act, we set something new in motion. And for Arendt, this is a part of her understanding of what it is that makes us human. Every political philosopher has an understanding of the kind of fundamental concept of the human condition. For Aristotle, it's we have logos, we have speech, and Arendt's picking up a lot of Aristotle there. For Marx, it's that we have the ability to apply our hands to raw materials and create objects. We have labor power. For Arendt, it's plurality, which is the condition of action. And it has the twofold quality of distinction and the disclosure of uniqueness. So when we act, we disclose who we are and we distinguish ourselves from others, but we also create something new. Every time we act, we set something new into motion. And that's Arendt's kind of fundamental principle of new beginnings and natality there. And it means that things can always be other than they are. Things can always be other than they are. As long as there are new people born into the world, things can always be other than they are. And this is part of the danger of science and technology and Descartes and this kind of Enlightenment thinking, which tries to teach us we can know the world, we can predict the future. For Arendt, this is not just anti-human, it is a way of foreclosing spaces of freedom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Joyce Mullen comments, yes, you can always expect the unexpected from humans. And there's, Arendt says almost something exactly like that, that's the most ordinary thing of all, right?
Yeah.
And Mahbub Hussein is pushing back a bit and asking, in a way that I wonder if it connects, Hannah Arendt analyzed the human condition only on the work, labor, and action dimensions. She totally ignored the play part of human life, hobbies, sports, passions, etc. Samantha was following the football game, the soccer football game very closely right before the beginning of this conversation. So I imagine she has something to say about this question, which is, so the human condition is an incomplete analysis. What is your take?
So Arendt does talk about play in the human condition. She has a whole section on hobbies, and with Adorno, she does not think hobbies are worthwhile activities. So for her, it's not a kind of omission, it's an intentional exclusion. And those distinctions, labor, work, and action, are attempting to understand what it is we're doing when we are, I'll say, making things in the world. And for Arendt, these have to do with value. So labor produces objects which are meant to be consumed almost as quickly as they're produced. Work objects are meant to be used over time, like a chair that you sit at for years and years and years, and it'll wear and give out eventually, but it's meant to be used. And then she comes to poetic value, which is what we get from action and the record of human experience and events, which is durable and yet incredibly fragile. For Arendt, when she's talking about play and hobbies and all those things that we do when we're not engaged in these fundamental activities of the human condition, she views them as a kind of, well, I mean, the way to say it is just waste of time. It's it's not a productive form of activity. Sure, it's possible a hobby artist could eventually be acquired by a great institution. But for Arendt, these activities have more to do with thinking about the changing conditions of labor in modernity and breaking from Marx by approaching them from the position of the object instead of the subject, to think about the world as an artifice thing, the thinginess of the world that we exist in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to switch gears a little bit, Thomas O'Brien is bringing us back to Heidegger, which is something that is interesting for me again, too. I'm interested in Hannah Arendt's views on Heidegger across the years, considering that they both died only 1 year apart. Near the end of his life, Heidegger elaborated more on his philosophy of technology, and some have put forward the thesis that one reason he was initially drawn to Nazism was that his views were that the Nazis were able to solve some of his issues concerning technology. Of course, he was wrong in this, and it has been proposed that Heidegger felt that the Nazis, in fact, had failed him. Was this in any way reflected in Arendt's thinking regarding Heidegger in the later years?
Not, my initial response is not that I'm aware of. No, she publishes The Human Condition in 1958, and she does kind of pick up and move with some of Heidegger's early writing on technology and thinginess, which we were just talking about in that book. But Arendt, I think, moves more toward thinking, and I'm not a Heidegger scholar, so I won't give you my readings of Heidegger.
And it's 3:00. Do you have time to stay, Sam? We have several more questions. Yeah. Okay. And it's Zoom, so we won't be bothered if you leave the room. That's not like. Ludmila Franca Lipka. Hi, Sam. Great talk. I would like to hear from you. I would like to hear from you. How do you interpret the expression thinking without a banister, considering what's thinking for Arendt? Does this expression express a way of thinking, or rather the abyss we were thrown at after totalitarianism? Or the abyss that we're thrown?
Wonderful question. Thank you. And I wish I could see you. So in the collection of essays, Thinking Without a Banister, which is that thick yellow volume right there, which was compiled by Jerome Cohn, in an interview panel conversation, Arendt says that she has always kept this secret metaphor for herself to describe her kind of methodology in thinking, her way of thinking, and it's thinking without a banister. And she gives the image of wandering endlessly up and down a staircase without anything to hold on to. There is something to stand on, and it very much has to do with the break in tradition. The Human Condition was initially meant to be titled Karl Marx and the Great Tradition. It was about this break in tradition. So Arendt argued that with the phenomenal appearance of totalitarianism in the middle of the 20th century, the tradition of Western political thinking had been broken. And she felt liberated to jump over the centuries, which we see in her writing and her sentences even, to the metaphor, the other metaphor that she uses is pearl diving, which she takes from Benjamin and from The Tempest, full fathom 5, thy father lies of eyes with coral made. And the idea that we're not bound to the tradition, but that we can dive through the wreck of history to bring forward those gems that might help illuminate our present moment. The thinking without a banister, the absence of banisters, is that loss of tradition for Arendt. It's the loss of those traditional conceptual categories that don't reflect the world that we live in now, and that can't help us make sense of it or try and understand it.
I've always wondered about that, if it's a like a translation of going in and out of the cave. Like that's what I think of in the classical idea of ascending and descending, but in this case without there's no banister in Plato's cave either, but it puts me in mind of like coming up from the basement of experience and back down again. And
well, it's the stage. In The Life of the Mind, when Arendt comes to talk about thinking, when we act, we are in the world of appearances. We are on stage, and other people can see us doing what it is that we're doing, but we don't get to tell our own story. We don't get to write the critique or the narrative of what happened on the stage. And so we retreat from the stage, and we can have to become, she talks about umpires being on the sideline, pulling back in order to see the activity. And that's part of that solitude.
Yeah. I'm gonna just have to choose one last question from Thomas Augsburg, who says, "For me, Arendt's strength comes from her being both extremely modern and contemporary, and an ancient, timeless Greek thinker with a perspective almost from eternity. In that way, she's an ideal for us today, I think. What do you think, Samantha?"
Sure, yes, absolutely. That's
ideal for us.
Arendt, I think one of the incredible things about Arendt, and this is, I'm stealing this, it's not mine, and I wrote it in the conclusion to the book. Jerry Cohn said to me once that the problem with Hannah Arendt was that she knew too much. And she, when she wrote, she would take dictation from herself. So she would She would think, and then she would come to her typewriter and she would write it out. It was there. She would take dictation from herself. But that thinking for her was a conversation. And she had read all of Plato, all of Aristotle. She had read all of Kant by the time she was 14. She had memorized Homer in ancient Greek. She had learned Latin. She was studying theology. She could recite Schiller, Brecht. She had read everything. She had devoured it and it had become part of her thinking. And so she's having conversations. One of the things that she would do when she was reading Kant is she would like cross off a word that Kant had wrote and she'd write her own word. And then when she's thinking about it and then she sits down to write it, she writes her line, not Kant's. It's her conversation. And I think that's one of the things that makes her such an incredible thinker. Arendt isn't interested in telling us what to think, but she does give us a model for how to engage in the work of thinking. And it has nothing to do with institutional boundaries or selfishness or being tied to a tradition or school of thought. She felt liberated in her thinking and writing, which I think is one of the reasons she is so provocative and also so infuriating for so many people. She's irreverent in her writing in that way. And I write at the beginning that Arendt became a writer by accident. That was not her intended career path. She decided to write because she wanted to understand the world, and writing for her was a part of the process of understanding.